accord on this. So on the question of, sorry, I'll just recapitulate the last bit. I was hoping for, of course, we can have a notion of a frame being not well-grounded because it contains undefined terms. Now, if we say it contains terms and assuming the definitions form an acyclic graph, are there foundational definitions? And those are community dependent. So we cannot have a syntactic notion of well-groundedness. But what I'm realizing is really what's important about a term is whether it's adopted by a large enough community. Mm-hmm. So what I'm thinking is, instead of just saying there's these axiomatic definitions, which I don't believe in, or saying there's these community local axioms, which is too local and doesn't take into account the community aspect. Mm-hmm. What about saying a definition is assumed well-grounded insofar as it's accepted by many communities, and then have and not contested by too many ones. And that would be not an absolute definition. It would be changing. It would be relative, but still, there's still an incentive, I think, for a community to be able to say, this is grounded in well-accepted, uncontested definition events. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Stephen is... Stephen has 20 minutes, so he'll join us. And I think I want to repeat that part to him because he did not hear that part yet.
If you want to wait for him to repeat, it's hard because I feel bad coming in and offering my own, my own whatever,
no,
different view, because
go for it. We're working on this. That's the whole point.
Well, so I know at one point we were sort of in the mindset of that all definitions ultimately come down to, sort of a circularity. And so it makes me nervous, this sort of, if there's any, deep dependence on a DAG of, ultimately grounded terms. But I don't know, maybe for practical reasons it's necessary. Maybe I just need to think about it. I mean, certainly you do have to, at some point make some, allowances just to make a system usable. Actually, but just make sure I have the context, and also like when we get off, the video you're referring to, is it the one that's uploading now? I see Paulus, pre-canonical syntax, social.
It should not be uploading now. It should be fully uploaded.
Let's see, let me maybe refresh. I'll refresh the page. My view says uploading 81%. Still at 81%.
It told me it was finished. I even deleted it. Damn it! It's possible it's gone now.
Oh shoot!
Hi, Stephen. I'll look on my. How are you?
Hello. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
We may have a problem. It's possible I lost the video because I thought it was fully uploaded. It told me it was, and then from yesterday, from Carl looked and it said, "Oh, uploading 81%," and I don't have it anymore. I'll have a look.
Oh, you wanted to watch yesterday's recording, Carl?
I was mentioning it.
Yeah,
I was just trying to context on things like frames and at this point I've missed some of the terms that you were mentioning, Marc-Antoine.
For that, there's some older recordings, I think, that introduce those concepts because they weren't introduced yesterday either, actually.
Okay.
The frames is not new, but a lot of the discussion about the context was new and valuable, I think.
Oh, the discussion at the end.
Yeah.
Actually, I think I tried to write meeting notes yesterday and then got sidetracked.
I even have deleted video here. Fuck. I shouldn't have been so sorry. Pardon me. We're recording. Oh, well. Oh, Felix, how are you? Oh, no. That's the still being processed. We're processing this video.
I mean, maybe it did upload and maybe okay. Other people just see a different view than you. So maybe after time it'll show up.
No, it says deleted video for me.
Oh, it does? That's weird.
Oh, we're processing this video. Check back later. Still being processed. Funny. Well, let's see what happens.
But I think you can also just ask for a very short, although that's always tricky, asking a short definition to Marc-Antoine. But maybe it's a good challenge for yourself, Marc-Antoine. Introduce what a frame is in below 1 minute.
Yeah. The frame. Okay. I thought I'd be defining context, but frame is from Marvin Minsky early research. It's basically a schema for key value. So it's a bit like an ontology. The advantage of a frame is that it has default values. So it's partly a UX thing. It has typical values. It has truth conditions. So the idea of using frames is especially to describe events or claims. Like they would be more claim structured. Like typically how frames being used in AI is to derive likely values of attributes of an entity from a partial description because there's likely values in the frame. And I don't want to use frames for entities so much, though it's possible, but it's another layer, so to speak. But for me, it's really important to have frames as a way to handle n-ary claims. Like, for example, if I said, John gave a ball to Mary at 3:30, whatever. So the notion of subject, object, predicate, giver, recipient, thing, and time and place would be part of the frame. Like it makes sense for that frame to have those things defined. And the reason I'm insisting on frames, of course, you can do all that with triples and property value, but it's about chunking. It's about many things. It's about transactionality of the frame as a unit, being able to contest the frame as a unit rather than item by item. But it's really chunking. It's about to be able to speak of all this set of situation as a unit and be able to speak about that unit. So that's the base. And of course, if you have frames as subjects of frames, you have a recursive hypergraph, as I've always been saying. But I was trying to build a recursive hypergraph from tiny atoms, from triples, and realizing it's not working so well because I often need to refer to a bunch of things together. So that's not the most important aspect, but it's an important aspect. The other aspect is the part of the progressive formalization. You can have an informal frame where some of the terms are just names left undefined, and sometimes the names are connected to an immutable definition. Immutable doesn't mean that it cannot evolve, but the transition between immutable definitions is not the same. Then you'd probably want to propagate a change. Like if I'm replacing this definition by this one because it's better defined or whatever, then I would have to propagate changes to the frames using the old definition. And that allows us to have each frame to be a little immutable unit whose meaning is grounded in definitions. Now, the problem is, what is the foundation of that? And news to you since yesterday, Stephen, what I'm arguing now is, you're right that it's very hard to ground a frame without axioms. And axioms are necessarily community local. And we had a lot of discussion about community as a concrete object. Like this is a community that accepts those definitions, maybe accepts certain truth values of certain axioms. Maybe that should be separate, still thinking that one true, but agrees to go by a certain set of shared definitions. That's the most important point. And as long as the definitions are uncontested, then the frame is well-grounded. Now, how do you ground this tree of axioms from a definition, assuming the definition's grounding is acyclic? So you have community local axioms. There's a problem that this is local only, and you cannot say that of a frame in the abstract. Do you use a set of shared axioms? But I think that's impossible to agree on. And now I'm thinking we could have a relative measure of community acceptance. This basic definition has been accepted in so many communities and contested in so many communities. And this could be an approximate number. Like I'm still thinking of Bloom filters to measure. Here is the Bloom filter of communities that accepted this definition. Here's the Bloom filter of those that contested it. And get, okay, this definition is uncontroversial at this point in time. And so it can be used to build. And if it becomes more controversial, then each community can revisit, okay, so some of our definitions that build on this are not well-grounded anymore, or some of our definitions that we can start replacing our local definition with, or connect one of our local definitions with an agreed upon definition so that it becomes well-grounded. The beauty of that is that you can really work independently to make your statements more well-grounded, hence more universally intelligible, which doesn't mean they'll be accepted, right? The moon is made of cheese can be made well-grounded, which is of value in and of itself.
You mentioned you created like a prototype, and I think that's why we brought up the video initially. Is that what is? I mean, what does the prototype look like? And even I think you also were working on something too. Like you said, you're going to work on adding to Socrates anchoring or fragments or something.
What the prototype that's orthogonal, not orthogonal, but I'm not there yet. What the prototype does is basically a way to a toy frame database that allows pointing to a frame.
Yeah. Like, so what did you do? Did you create, is it relational? And did you, I mean, because I'm curious when you talk about these frames, I mean, to me, frames sound very restrictive because, I mean, maybe it's because I haven't thought about it enough to come up with some clever, structure for frames that's generic, but I just think that there's so many different frames you would need in a global database.
One thing that's really important is that frames are restrictive by design, but there's no restriction on an entity being defined by a single frame. So you can have multiple frames describing different aspects of what is known about an entity.
Okay. As in, like, they have different placeholders that, I mean, in each one, the entity appears in those different frames. Okay. Yeah. So, then is there a library of acceptable frames, like structure?
That's something that we can build, but there's an existing frame library that I totally intend to build on, and it's the Harvard FrameNet. No, it's not Harvard, sorry, Stanford FrameNet.
I remember all this now, yeah. Sorry.
No, absolutely.
Lost context.
There's a lot of context. So yeah, I'm not hoping for like there will be a very basic notion of non-well-grounded frame because it has undefined names, but the notion of how well a frame is grounded, I think, is going to be a bit more dynamic. But I'm thinking that the notion that a term gains axiomatic status because it's socially accepted by many communities makes a lot of sense to me. It's of course, it means it's a bit of a cross-layer thing, but or rather, it means that grounding is in the upper layers. But I think that having a layer for well-defined, which is independent from the layer for accepted, is going to be useful in and of itself. And well-defined being based on being grounded in well-defined terms, and that is, and grounded up to a point means uncontested, but that's good enough. As long as it's transient quality, it's uncontested until it isn't. Stephen, you're mute.
I'm trying to understand the difference between acceptance and grounded.
A frame,
because if suppose you just have a non-formalized claim, there's no frames whatsoever, you just have a claim, and of, let's say we're talking about the base layer now, right? Like a lower layer, not a community building on top of that. So if you have like 90% of all users that accept that claim,
yes,
how is that different from that claim being grounded in your current vocabulary?
It is and it isn't, in the sense that it can be taken as an axiom, so it's grounded, but it would be like, okay, and maybe that means there's a flaw in my system, but not that much. See, what I would like to say is this is interpretable as, like, let's say the moon is made of cheese, because I think it's a great example. The moon is made of cheese is a statement. Let's say everybody refuses it, so it's not grounded that way, or the moon is made of.
But the moon is not made of cheese would be grounded then.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But what's interesting is that if you could imagine somebody making a specious argument with redefining cheese. So what you'd want to do is to say the moon is not made of cheese, replace it by the frame where made of is well-defined, moon is well-defined, and cheese is well-defined. And then you can say moon is made of cheese sentence is interpretable as this one, which is also well-grounded.
Can I suggest a definition for grounded based on, because I think I understood that, but I'm just asking you to double check. But could the difference be, because I said this claim is not formalized, but would a different, what you would call grounded, and be, suppose the claim is more formalized and it indeed contains a frame of what moon is and what cheese is? Would you call it grounded if 90% of people not only accept the claim, but also accept the frames, if you will, or the
definitions of the frames.
Definitions? Yeah. Like if 90% of people accept the definition of moon, accept the definition of cheese, and accept the claim, would you call that grounded?
Yes.
Okay.
So groundedness has to do with acceptance by a group of people, or
acceptance of the assumptions that are formalized in the claim.
Of the definition. Moon for me, moon is made of cheese is well grounded. I expect it to be refused by everybody, but it's well grounded and it's well defined. Like all the terms are well defined. Suppose it's made of the frames and everybody agrees on what moon is, what cheese is, and what made of means. Moon is made of cheese is well grounded. It's well-grounded and
the relevance versus truth discussion.
What?
This is the relevance versus truth discussion, right? Like it's grounded because you understand what it's talking about precisely, but you may disagree with its truth.
I don't think it's relevance. It's well-definedness.
Yeah. Okay. So I always I like to define context as the set of shared assumptions that. Yeah. Or I don't know whether I would, either way, it's one thing that keeps popping up when context is mentioned. What is it? Well, it's a set of shared assumptions. I think that's some of the stuff we talked about yesterday. There is some overlap there, right? So for me, indeed, that's why I want to go. And like, I think when you're talking about relevance, one shared assumption should be that you need to assume that the premise is true. When you're discussing relevance, you're not discussing whether or not the premise is true or false. You need to assume within the discussion, let's assume the premise is true. Under that condition, is it relevant or not? So for me, when discussing relevance, I would say you could call that I don't know whether you would call it a framework component, but what is common there is there's a set of shared assumptions you need to accept going to the definition. It's very similar to when indeed you want to talk about the moon is made of cheese. If you want to discuss a more specific version of the moon is made of cheese, where you have a concrete definition of moon and cheese, you're not arguing about what moon of cheese is. You need to assume one definition of moon and cheese. And if in that case, people accept, for the sake of that claim, the definitions or the assumptions, for me, assumption is a generalization here, as well as the claim, then indeed And maybe when you say Bloom filter, it's like when you can detect collections of these, or
yeah, Bloom filter is a way to do. It's a way to do probabilistic numbers. There's many ways. It's just a way, a way. But what I'm saying is, it's not important to know whether it's 99.9 or 99.8 people percent who approve. It's important to have a kind of order of magnitude on a log scale of how many people approve, but that makes it easier to calculate.
Okay.
Yeah.
But this means that groundedness is an emergent property yet again, not something you would model.
Correct.
I mean, it's something that based on the current state of people having accepted certain various statements, you can derive from about a claim.
Yeah. And there's degrees of connectedness. And what's nice is that once you accept that notion that well-groundedness is emergent, and I agree totally with you, then you can speak about degrees of well-groundedness. For example, if I have just a name, a term in my local social context, in my local community, that is shared, or if the community is just me, then of course the term is not well-grounded at all. It's just a name. If I start putting a definition, well, it's a bit more well-grounded, even if the definition is just words. Now, the really important moment is when I start getting people to agree to use my definition. And I've grown the community of people who agree on that meaning of that word. But what I'm realizing is, for example, if I point to a dictionary definition, I said, I'm using HarperCollins dictionary or whatever dictionary, and this is well, already I'm pointing to a large community. So it gives it a groundedness level. If I'm pointing to Wikipedia, Wikidata, I'm pointing to a big community of people who have accepted that term. So my work is not fully done, but done to a much higher degree. That term is much more well-grounded with minimal effort. For me, the ideal well-groundedness is if I can point to any hyper-knowledge-aware dictionary. And for me, hyper-knowledge-aware means I am able to ask the dictionary, was that definition revised? Like I can point to the definition and I can point to, was this definition contested? Was it revised? Was it, and then I know that I have the dynamic quality of groundedness.
Yeah, but I mean, then you're talking about authority. I mean,
yes,
because there's, in a way, a dictionary they are terms that a lot of people agree on or decide to agree on, and they are communicated because dictionaries also change based on how communities use words.
Absolutely.
It's not a one-way thing, right?
Correct.
Just consider how racism was redefined recently. Or extended to include, depending on, but it is what you're implying now is some type of feature on an architecture level where one particular entity, like somebody that manages a dictionary, has an authoritative voice in terms of accepting one of the definitions. And if one of those definitions is used in a claim, then it's automatically grounded, or?
I'm saying certain technical artifacts represent a certain level of community acceptance and a certain level of groundedness. I'm not saying that the dictionary is automatically accepted, but I'm saying this is, if it made it there, there's at least a significant community who agree on this usage. It's a community-owned definition as opposed to an individually owned definition. So we can say that this is grounded to a very high level. I don't know, I'm not saying it's absolute. I'm saying it's a high level. And I could say, for example, even within artifacts, there could be degrees.
I'm trying to generalize already here, right? I'm saying the difference here is if I accept the definition versus if an entity that accepts the definition. It's the same operation, just saying that the fact that this entity is Merriam-Webster has more value than me as one particular individual accepting.
Well, precisely because, as you pointed out, I'm aware that Merriam-Webster reflects community usage. So Merriam-Webster represents a large number of speakers. And for me, what makes something well-grounded is collective agreement. And it turns out that some entities like Merriam-Webster make it a point to reflect collective agreement and are trusted to reflect collective agreement. That doesn't mean it's permanent, but it means it's at a given point. But anyway, I think this distinguishing well-defined from accepted is absolutely important. Anyway, and being able to say this is defined, grounded in accepted definitions, like the recursive property of this is what we know. This is well defined because it's defined in terms of of accepted terms. Is, you know, of terms with accepted definitions of well-defined terms, making well-defined into a recursive property. So even if you're coining a new term, a new concept, if you can define it in terms of accepted terms.
Is it sufficient if people accept it, or people need, you have sub-communities, you have communities with very precise definitions.
Yep.
Does that mean these definitions are not accepted? Or if there's nobody not accepting, like, I did say saying I don't think these are good definitions, then they're not well.
I did say at first how many people accept this definition, how many people contest it. So that's one aspect. So
okay.
If a specialized vocabulary, I assume, will be accepted by a small community but contested by nobody else outside of that community. So that's fine. But I think you're right. There is also a mechanism where a word is used in one way by this community, another way by that community.
Of course. And then, even within communities, words are used in multiple ways.
Yep. So well, that's easy. That one is contested. If it's one community.
How is it contested? Even Merriam-Webster entries have multiple meanings linked to one word.
Yeah, that way, yes. Okay, no, you're right. That's just ambiguity. That's different. That's a different phenomenon. But
it's not always ambiguity. Sometimes it's generality. It can, and a big part of discussion is, should it be interpreted as ambiguous or general specific?
Yep. You're right. But what I'm saying is there's also very much a case of conflict. Like people want to define this thing this way or that way, and they're arguing about that. So that's one case. And there's a case where, and this is closer to your emergent contexts, this word is used systematically in this way in this community and systematically in that way in that community. And this is really an interesting case which we want to represent differentially, which is saying this word is globally contested, but locally
But yeah. So yeah, Carl, to relate this back to the discussion from yesterday, we're just talking what is the role of explicitly defined communities and whether or not that happens and how is that related to context. And I don't think we have all the answers yet, except that Marc-Antoine and I agree it's useful to explicitly define communities. Because a lot of knowledge building happens within explicitly defined communities. And it makes a lot of sense to, within a community, keep track of shared assumptions that you can like test, a bit like a glossary process, actually. Like, do we agree on this shared terminology here? And as a community, your goal is to increase the set of shared assumptions, which in a sense builds up context that implicitly is used within any claims uttered within that community. My big concern is how does that relate to canonical arguments? Because once you want to reuse claims uttered in that community in a broader context outside of the community, how do you do that? And I think that's why we ended the last meeting. And I still want to go through some examples of that.
Sorry, I could not work on examples since yesterday. But what the point for me of making those well-grounded definitions is being able to say, well, when I'm exporting that claim, it's well-grounded means it's well-defined enough that because it's using terms on which there's no dissensus with who I'm explaining.
But it's an emergent property, so then it's at that point in time, and what is the implication if that changes, etc. So I'm not certain that resolves anything.
No, I think that's correct, but that's perfectly fine. It's if it changes, if the term becomes contested, you get alerted in your community, hey, that term has become contested, so you'll have to like fork it and say, okay, here's how we interpret it. And maybe give it another name, and then rework up.
Yeah, but I'm more concerned what it is that you export.
Yes. What you export.
Remember, I summarized like an initial impression would be by default, given that the community has shared assumptions that are somewhat implicit in claims uttered in that community. Yeah. It would make sense to me when you export any claim uttered in that community to attach all those shared assumptions to the context of that claim you're exporting. But there's a bit of overhead there because you don't know whether all of them are needed.
And what I said
that seems to be implied.
What I said is if you make the local assumption dependencies part of the claim, the local ones only. And of course, it's a graph, so it will recursively include more.
What are the local ones?
Well, the definitions for the terms in the frame.
Yeah, but okay.
And the assumptions, the explicit presuppositions. So you make those explicit, you attach them to the frame.
But then you're assuming that everything is always fully formalized according to community standards. I think that's part of the problem.
No, I'm saying that it's visible whether things are formalized or not. So you know that when you have not done it, you can export it, but it's ambiguous. You know that syntactically you're using undefined terms. And if you have done the formalization work, then you know it's quote unquote more ready to export. And the idea is to make it really convenient and easy to go from an informal statement to a more formal statement by saying, oh, I'm just reusing this term from Wikipedia. Good enough.
Yeah.
But have a little flag saying, have you defined your terms?
I think, yes, that would definitely improve it. I have to head out soon, by the way. So I think we can also maybe leave it. Well, I will leave it at this. I think that will help, but I mean, there's still the problem that while you're in a context, be it a community, or while you're even within one specific claim and arguing about it, the process of pulling in context is a very unconscious act.
Correct. You're absolutely right.
And I think like the notion of defining an explicit community to help that might help, but I'm thinking more and more by default, any claim uttered within a community probably, it's maybe what you say, shouldn't be exported to any canonical database. And the act of exporting it to a canonical database is a tedious job. And yes, you can simplify it, but it is that free of context stuff that we talked about. Right?
But what I'm saying also, that's right up to a point, but I'm also saying it's always up to contestation, right? You could, in my mind, export it to canonical database, and then somebody points out, hey, this assumption is missing. And
in the community.
Yeah.
Not in larger, the canonical database.
Or even outside, or in another community.
No. Yeah, okay. But I mean, this assumption is missing implies that there is apparently a shared assumption to be pointing to. The point is, once it lands in a canonical database, there isn't, by definition, that's what I call free of context claims. Anything that's not defined there's no shared assumption.
But this is why, for me, it's very important that even immutable things can evolve. And I can ask the Federation, what is the latest version of this immutable thing? Because if somebody points out a missing presupposition, anybody, anywhere, in any community, then, and people agree, yeah, that was indeed a missing implicit presupposition, then we can say, okay, then this statement that looked well-grounded is actually replaced by this one that is better grounded, because we've added at least one missing presupposition. There may be more, but that improvement is made, and then it propagates back.
I'm telling you that works within one community, but not across communities. I don't see that scale. And that's why in a canonical database, they should be fully immutable. And yeah, sure.
Why do you say it doesn't scale?
Yeah, I don't see that.
How you have communities are like, as Mike and Torn already pointed out, in a way, every individual is one community. And as an individual, you partake in multiple communities. Yes. So there's even more communities than there are individuals on Earth. Like, yes. How are you gonna address versioning across so many communities and find agreement across so many different communities? When you agree that something is a proper evolution of a certain term, etc., I don't see that work. I rather embrace the ambiguity, which is what I always say. If it's not defined, it's not defined. We can all accept. We accept this ambiguous term, and that means that wherever this claim is being used, it's ambiguous. Yes, it's relevant to discuss about that ambiguity.
But I'm fine with that. But as a stage, for me, it's important to say we embrace the ambiguity at stage one, and then somebody gives a more precise definition. If people are happy with that one, they have to adopt it. And yes, adoption has to be individual.
If people are happy with that, who? Which community?
How
do you align
individual,
that? That's the problem.
Each individual in each community independently says, yes, that's better. But at some point, you
realize,
if
they say no?
What if they say no? This is where you get into the numbers game. You realize you're relying on a term that has been redefined by a few people, the majority of people, and then that your term that was once well-grounded has become less well-grounded because the majority of people have wanted to replace it with this one, which is better, now better accepted. So if you want your term to be considered well-grounded, you probably have to explain how you differ from it and redefine your term in a way that takes into account so that you keep your well-grounded status, your terms keep their well-grounded status. Your terms, if enough people accept that the missing
accepting
assumption
definitions is very context dependent.
Yes, it is.
That's community dependent.
Yes, explicitly.
So how do I say I agree with the definition?
That
with or without context.
No, not without context. You do it in your community. In your community where you've been using this, you accept it. And you say, okay, in my community now, in my individual or collective community, and then the collective has to have this agreement process. I said that was part of the community definition. We think, yes, this added precision is useful, relevant, yada, yada. We accept this refinement. And then people who are not using the refinement at first are majority, but as they become aware, oh, this refinement is being is emergent and seems relevant to a lot of people. So should I adopt it? Yes, no. And then it's a numbers game. And then when enough people have accepted it, the original without the refinement loses its well-grounded status because it's no longer the most accepted definition. And then if you want anything you've built on this to keep the well-grounded status, you'll have to maybe come up with a new definition, which is fine in terms of well-grounded terms.
Like I concluded last time, let's go over this with a real scenario, because we can define communities, define a term, define claims that use that term, and then let's see like how communities can. I think that's going to be a good exercise to just walk through that scenario.
Fair enough.
Okay, see you next week.
See you next week.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we were talking sense to you or
sort of. Yeah. It's my community is trying to align with your community.
Yeah. And and again, it doesn't mean we have to agree on all the terms, but if I'm able to take the terms we disagree on and define them in terms of terms we agree on, it's a win. Because now I know what you mean by this term and you know what I mean by this term. And that's the effort of groundedness.
Yeah. There's a bunch of things that occurred to me while you two were talking, but like on that one, on that note, again, I'm open to Stephen's point that it's not scalable, but it doesn't seem that the system would be unscalable. It's just you have to figure out, okay, what are your limitations? Like you can't force two communities to adopt the same terminology or definitions. Like it just isn't realistic to expect that all the time. But what you could do is you could create a bridging layer, something that says, okay, some people here, or maybe some people even external to the two communities have an interest in finding the correlations between the two, and inside the system that, ideally, someone has created, the CDL's created or whoever, they say, okay, this thing looks like that. Here's my, evidence for saying that they're the same. And, whenever you see this over here, it should probably be this and vice versa, something like that. Like you can put a layer in between.
That's one aspect. But for me, what's simpler than that and should be the general case is if we disagree on a term, which is perfectly possible, we should, as I said, we should both be able to define it in terms we agree on, right? And then we'll both have different definitions, non-equivalent definitions. And then, okay, we know that when you use this, I know that when you use this term, you mean this, and vice versa. And it does, for me, it's not essential that we all have the same definition for the same terms. But what's important is that when I say, you know, I think this term you're using is ambiguous because sometimes you're using it this way, sometimes you're using it that way. I can explicitly say that's unclear, and then you can easily say, okay, in terms of this contestation, which makes my argument less well-grounded, I can easily correct that accusation of not well-groundedness by refining my definition using and resolving the ambiguity you've pointed out. And again, that doesn't mean that we'll arrive at the same definition, but that's not important. What's important is you can make your usage of the terminology very clear in terms of terms that I'm not contesting.
Yeah, that all makes sense, and I agree. I think kind of, and I think what you're talking about is, yeah, like an elaboration of like this sort of intermediate layer I was discussing. The thing that comes up for me that sort of my intermediate or bridging layer, how I would, that concept kind of distinguishes from what I think. So I think you're discussing, here's a community, you know, someone identifies that they, you know, have a term that's, you know, not consistently used, and someone inside either of the communities then makes effort to, you know, define the other term in terms of like community's term. But I think what I'm trying to get at is that there are times when two communities lack motivation to connect, like, and
it doesn't matter because someone outside can do it.
That was kind of it, right? That I think it's important to allow someone outside the community, if there's no interest in either community in connecting, I think there should be the opportunity for someone who's not in neither community to connect them, right? Because and that was another thought that occurred to me, is questions of like, well, how do you define community? Are we talking about, you know, open communities, closed communities? Like, is there, you know, is it relatively democratic membership? Is it, you know, controlled by a small moderator group? I mean, and I know that's like getting into a whole, you know, nest of thorny problems, but it's important to consider, because if this is a closed community, and this is a closed community, and, you know, the dictator, whatever, the closed process of this community is not letting anyone in who wants to merge, you know, concepts with that one, and vice versa. You need something, you need the opportunity in a system that's, you know, trying to do what CDL is trying to do to have someone who is motivated to connect the terms.
Absolutely. Okay, and that's absolutely important. I realized the other part of the conversation yesterday that was really useful and important. God, I can't believe I lost that recording. Is when Stephen's speaking about context, he means an emergent cultural context, right? Like there's people who use terms in this way, or community of practice, or all of these. And when I was speaking of context, and I thought I had made that clear, I'm always speaking about explicit communities. And that means for me, a context is, here's one person or a bunch of people who have defined a community. And the answer to your, oh, is it closed, is it open, is blah, 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 this is all of the above. Like, for me, deciding how the community works is a community concern, and is out of scope for us to define. However, it has to be well defined, meaning
the system's going to use it and model it. It has to be well defined.
Exactly, it has to be well defined so the system can model it. There is a notion of exactly who is in, who is out, and it has to have its own community chosen decision procedure of which statements, definitions, and so on they accept and refuse, and how. Is it unanimity? Is it majority vote? Is it dictatorship? Shouldn't matter. But each community must have its own well-defined process for deciding, and I should be able to query a server that represents the community opinion as, did you accept that definition? Do you believe that's that claim? And I'm not sure is a perfectly valid answer. And as I keep speaking about social truth value, 20% of our community members believe that claim. That's a perfectly fine answer. But I have to have answers to those questions when I'm speaking to a community. Who's there? And then we get into, oh, do we allow anonymity and blah, blah, blah. And that is another, but there should be a way to know, okay, how many people are there? That should be more important. But then you get into issues of sock puppet communities. And anyway, right. I won't go into that, but there is.
And brigading. You know, if it's an open community and this group says, oh, we would really like to influence them, then, you know, they allow themselves in because it's an open community, and now they've changed the definition. And the people who formerly were that community, they say, wait, that's not our definition.
Yeah. So there's a whole layer there, which again, defining all the rules of the game is out of scope. Defining the notion that it has to be well defined is in scope. For me. But once you have that, my purely gut feeling hypothesis needs to be empirically justified, is that I expect a lot of communities to emerge that would align to the cultural communities that cultural context that Stephen's interested in, that more or less align. I may be wrong, or at least are representative samples of whenever there's a cultural emergent cultural context, there will arise explicit community contexts that more or less match them. But that's a hypothesis. But anyway, and of course, it's dependent on adoption of the system, yada, yada, yada. But this is why, like, modeling emergent cultural context is very hard. But I'm saying that's not necessary. If we have the notion of well-defined community, it's an adequate proxy. And then we can look at, and then some communities I expect will emerge with, we only accept people with a PhD in climatology, for example, you know, and that would be a community. And anybody with having a PhD in climatology is a necessary and sufficient condition to be in this community.
Yeah.
Right? And that becomes a community who can speak for climatologists and needn't be unanimous, but I expect a certain percentage of agreement. But it's explicitly defined this way, and it can speak with the authority that this confers. So that's one thing. And then we'll have a different one with anybody who has a PhD related to any climate adjacent science, and that and we'll get physicists with weird ideas about reflectance, and that's okay. But we know that these are not the climatologists.
Yeah, it seems useful to have the communities be defined based upon, what's the word? I want to say objective criteria, but that sounds tricky because I say objective and then someone's like, oh, you're expecting too much out of objectivity. Because what I was imagining was communities that, you know, define their own terms of inclusion, and that those communities could then tailor their membership based upon, you know, certain agreement or disagreement with, you know, say certain things. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. But that's the point. So the clear idea of membership is one part of the community, and shared premises is the other, shared definitions and maybe shared premises is the other. I'm still wondering whether these two need to be distinguished. I'm not sure, but certainly shared definition is broader than shared premises. And maybe I need to have kind of Russian doll model where shared premises is a subset of the shared definition one. But I'm still hesitating on this one. But shared definition is absolutely part of what makes a community a community. And that doesn't mean there won't be contestation within the community, and that's fine. But then you create sub-communities. And that is very important to me. The notion of creating community must be a really, I obviously have a community for myself. I'm creating a community for exploring a hypothesis. What if this is true and what derives from that? For me, that's a new context. And I should be able to do that casually. I'm exploring this idea, and maybe it's a harebrained idea, but I'm exploring an idea. And I'm creating a context where this idea is assumed true, and let's see what that allows. And I'm not claiming it to be true, but it's a casual sub-reality creation. And let's see what that entails. And that's a kind of brainstorming tool. What if? And being able to say, when that enables me to look at the membrane between social communities and between sets of assumptions, and say, what can I, when I want to port this idea from this hypothesis to things I actually believe, okay, what are the preconditions for making this happen, and so on. And
yeah, that's interesting. Mm-hmm.
Cool. And what makes it acceptable. But this notion that, well, I can create a new well-defined terms if I define it in a strict fashion from accepted well-defined terms, I think is really important as a way of accepted is not just well, grounded is not just stuff that is universally accepted. It's something that is defined in a well-defined way from accepted terms. Mm-hmm. And that means I can build on the well-defined pyramid without having acceptance. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes a valid object of discussion. So that's what I'm working on.
Yeah, cool. It's good to see you. I should probably run and get started with my day.
Yeah. We're at the hour. I think it's a good stopping point.
But sorry, I haven't been as present. I'll do my best to be around, but yeah, maybe the usual kind of in and out until
we all have lives.
Yeah, cool.
Enjoy.
All right. Yeah, take care, Marc-Antoine. Bye.
Goodbye, Carl.